And we're live. How's it, guys? Welcome back to another cracking installment of this crazy show, which seemingly won't go away in your earbuds. And today I'm joined by an Australian, if you can believe that, living in New York, amongst the myths and terror and chaos and panic of the coronavirus. Brett King, welcome to the show.
G'day, mate. Whoop, whoop. How are you?
Yeah, good, man, good.
Coming to you live from New York.
Under lockdown. How's that working out for
lockdown.
You? Just describe everything. What's going on there?
I'm about 3 days from running out of toilet paper because you can't get any. No. Last night we went out for a run to get some groceries, knowing that you're going to have stay-in-place order, which is going to happen probably later today. Stay-in-place order means that you are allowed to go out, but only for essential things. So you can go out to the groceries, you can go out to pick up food, or you can go to a health center, like a hospital or a urgent care medical center. But pretty much everything else is closed. Restaurants are closed, schools are closed. They're limiting the subway use, et cetera. It's pretty surreal to be in New York during this type of a period. But the US is quite unique in their response to coronavirus in that almost half of Americans don't even believe that it's true or believe that it's been overblown. So where you've got markets like or economies, countries like, say, China or Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, where the government says, hey, we got this big virus coming, this is what you need to do. Everyone's like, yep, on it straight away, Whereas in the US, they're like, let's go down and buy some guns because, in case people come and try to steal our food and toilet paper. It's insane. The response here is, as an outsider that's lived here for a decade, I still can't quite get my head around the US psyche sometimes, but anyway.
Well, yeah, it is frightening. I'm actually moving to the States, or I was. I don't know what's going to be left. Could be martial law and panic in the streets. You never know with these kind of things. To your point, it is
Martial law was trending on Twitter here the other day, but
really?
It was spelled Marshall as in MARSHALL.
All my American listeners probably don't think it's that funny.
Anyway,
it's hilarious, buddy. Yeah, well, look, I hope things, are okay over there.
Well, it's a global thing now, and I think we're recognizing is that. I think the really interesting part of this is that the US has been praised, for their economic performance, the most successful economy ever built in history, theoretically. But when you look at the way this economy works, it works on the basis that productivity and efficiency are, the central goal. And so when you have a healthcare system, the reason it's privatized is the theory is that it can be much, much more efficient than a nationalized or, government-run system. And as a result, you run it with minimal overcapacity because you don't want to have excess capacity that's not generating you returns. And so in today's situation, that leaves the US massively exposed to this problem of filling up their capacity very, very quickly, not having enough respirators for people who fall ill with coronavirus. So there is a real question as to whether or not under these extreme scenarios, whether capitalism is able to provide what is required for the citizens in the United States. And the answer right now, based on the response that we've seen so far, would appear to be a clear no. But we are yet to the point where the hospitals are overwhelmed here, but there's sort of an anticipation that it's coming.
Well, I think that's a pretty good point of departure around the premise for this episode, because we're going to talk about has the coronavirus, or is the coronavirus going to kill capitalism? I guess it's a black swan event. I've had a couple of people on the show now, and coronavirus seems to always come up for obvious reasons. But certainly, it feels like we're living in a black swan event. Is that fair to say? Would you characterize as where we're at today?
Well, a black swan event is something that we didn't anticipate, came out of the blue, unexpected, and really sort of changed markets and changed the way we thought of things. The problem is we've known this is coming. We've known for some time. There's a great video going around from Bill Gates at TEDx talk in 2015 right now, which shows that we knew this was coming. Now, the conspiracy theorists are going, well, Gates obviously designed it, but the reality is, we've seen pandemics occur all throughout human history. The bubonic plague, yellow fever, the Spanish flu, etc. And it's just a matter of time before we had something like this. And the reality is the increase in air travel and all of that, that's a new thing. We didn't have that back after the war when the Spanish flu hit, but we have it now. So the ability to sort of fast track a sort of a global pandemic like this, because of that, is the unknown factor in terms of how quickly this would spread. But we've known for a while, so I don't see it as a black swan event. I see it as the fact that we knew it was coming, but the black swan part of it is, or the downside is, we even though we had preparations in place, even though we knew exactly what was going to happen and exactly how we could mitigate the risk, when it came to the crunch, the globe didn't respond in the way that we had planned. Nations broke apart in terms of their compliance with the WHO guidelines that they had signed on to. You had politics start to get involved. You have social media impact. The U.S. election. Coming U.S. election was obviously a big element in terms of Trump's initial reactions to this. And so I don't think it's a black swan event. I think what it is I think we knew it was coming. I think we knew what we had to do to prepare for it. We weren't prepared to spend the money on preparing for it in the way we needed to. And when it did come, we didn't react in the way that we had spent many years planning to, because of local politics and things like that. So we could have reacted much better. That's all I'm saying, I guess.
Yeah, we certainly feels to me like we got caught with our pants down with this one.
Yep.
And the other thing that's irritating me about Trump at the moment is that he keeps calling this a fucking Chinese virus. Have you seen that stuff?
I have, and having lived in Hong Kong and going through SARS, which I did in 2003, it's just not helpful. And this requires a coherent global response to be effective, which requires governments to be working together. You can't have that if someone like Trump, one of the more powerful leaders in the world today, is criticizing China and claiming it's them. It's just not helpful. It's not going to produce an outcome that's beneficial to the Americans or anyone else. So, it's disappointing. The reality is, we've had a lot of coronaviruses from a lot of different sources. There's been U.S. coronaviruses. There's been MERS, the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. We had SARS, of course, which affected Canada significantly during that time. But obviously, the epicenter was in places like Hong Kong, southern China, and Singapore. So it doesn't make sense labeling this as a Chinese virus. Very unhelpful, and really is designed again to sort of pass the buck from the mistakes that Trump has made early on in the piece, where he called it a democratic hoax, where he said we've got 15 people infected, it's going down to 0, we're doing really well. All this messaging that was just wrong, and so now that it's sort of blowing back in his face, he's like, whoa, it's a Chinese virus, which is typical Trump deflection technique, unfortunately.
Divide and conquer, misinformation, And that's that. And that's exactly what he's doing. I mean, it's a sad thing. I must be careful what I say here because I'm still waiting for my green card to be processed. So,
well, I'm here. So
yeah, well, I mean, they let you in, you know.
Exactly.
And you're Australian.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's like when I start arguing again with Americans about the the Second Amendment stuff, you know, and they'll say if you don't like it, go home. And I'll say, listen, dude, your First Amendment right gives me the right to tell you that your Second Amendment sucks dog balls. You know, it's like so just get with it. So anyway,
that's funny. That's got to be the cliffhanger for this show. So let's get into the market stuff because I think it's fair to say that the 11-year bull market is officially dead. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, the big question right now is it going to be as big as the Depression? And I think in terms of losses, it probably already is up there. But I do think once we get to a new normal, I think it will return, you know, to recover most of the way. But it's going to take a few months before we get to that, you know. Yeah,
I was reading about the impacts of this virus on markets, and the U.S. travel industry is forecast to lose up to $24 billion. And about 825,000 jobs, I think it was the number that I recall, would actually lose employment, which is frightening.
Yes,
it's frightening.
Yeah, there's Mnuchin, the secretary, whatever he is now, economy guy here for Trump administration, said that they're expecting 20% unemployment because of coronavirus. And so you got a lot of proposals, which is crazy because, you know, they've been very, very bullish in the past. But I think that the key issue you've got is there's no social safety net for any of those people, really. You know, unemployment benefits are difficult to get here, difficult to qualify for. So you've got a lot of people right now, for example, hotel workers, you know, restaurant, you know, workers and so forth that have been laid off that live paycheck to paycheck, you know. And so, you know, this is really serious. You know, over half of Americans don't have enough saved to be able to handle a $400 shock to their budget, you know. And so this is really where it comes down to is even though this is the richest nation in the world, it's only taken this virus to completely unravel the system here and show its shortcomings. So, you know, and if you're and this we're not talking about a failure that affects a small percentage of the population here. You know, we're talking about the fact that you know, the majority of people are going to be dramatically economically affected by coronavirus and are going to get to the point where they cannot pay their rent. They, you know, don't have enough money for food. You know, we're talking about some really critical issues here, let alone the fact that if they do get coronavirus and they go in to get tested, in most cases, they're going to have to pay $1,300 because, you know, 20% of Americans don't have health insurance. And so they're going to pay $1,300 to get tested. Then if they require treatment, they are going to have to pay for the treatment themselves. Now, understand that 67% of all bankruptcies in the United States are medical cost related. So you can imagine what coronavirus is going to do to the health of the U.S. economy when it comes to the average American.
Did you hear that that balls up that Trump made when he did that, you know, State of the Nation, you know, when he banned European travel, and he kind of cocked up a few things in that speech, even though it was pre-scripted and what have you. Trevor Noah's got a fantastic sort of take on that, but one of the things he said was, yeah, don't worry. As part of we've negotiated, I've gone out and done a deal with the health companies of America, and you know, if you get coronavirus, you're covered. It's all good. We're sweet. But meanwhile, the truth of the matter was, it wasn't that. You still have to pay for all of your treatments, and then the only thing that's covered partially is the test itself.
Yeah, Well, the other aspect of this is, I've got my radio show going out tomorrow, and we just pre-recorded it yesterday. And on the show, we had Yobi Benjamin, who runs a biomed company, and he's been producing tests. So he offered tests to, the Californians, to New York City, and so forth, over 300,000 tests. He was able to even, create pop-up labs in New York to be able to test people rapidly and turn around the results within a few hours. And he, despite offering 300,000 tests to the governments to do this, he was told he couldn't set up these labs because he wasn't clear. That's CLIA compliant, which is a laboratory standard issued by the FDA. So, only two companies, Quest and one of the companies associated with Walgreens, were licensed to test. And as a result, last week, only 77 tests were done in the United States. And so this is insane. This is insane. And so even when you have Bill Gates coming in and, you have Jack Ma sending in tests, and you have other, people like this doing this, the capitalist system is such that you can't break into that system because the bureaucracy is rewarding these few companies that are licensed according to the US regs. And so now they're trying to put in place a way to circumvent these FDA regulations. But the problem with this has wasted valuable time. What we've seen from South Korea is that testing is absolutely critical to being able to understand what's going on with this virus in real time. And so that lack of testing in the United States is giving them, like bad numbers. That we just don't know how bad it is in the United States because we haven't got an accurate data set or denominator in respect to these metrics. So, yeah.
Do you know what the testing sort of product actually is, or the testing process actually is? Is it kind of like a swab in your mouth and then you put it in the dye and then you get it instantly? And then what's the cost of testing? I mean, because surely it would be a very similar test to something like that was around for SARS or H1N1 or whatever the case is.
So they swab both your mouth and your nasal passages. It takes, depending on the types of labs set up, the rapid test results take 30 to 45 minutes. Others take up to 4 hours to do. The figures that Yobi shared with us is that, for their lab, a test is going to cost about $80 to $90 to produce and come up with the results. And the US is allowed a $36 payment to those companies for providing those tests. So we've already got a problem right there. Mm-hmm. But the cost that's the cost, the raw cost of a test. But what a patient pays in the United States today is $1,300 to undergo a test.
Are you serious?
And so
is that the actual
serious.
number?
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, if it was me, I've got health coverage in the United States, which I pay $3,500 a month for, which is insane. And that would give me a $400 copay. So of the $1,300, $900 of that would be covered by insurance. $400 I'd have to pay.
Jeez.
That's for an $80 test.
I've been advised by a few entrepreneurs that have made the jump over the pond to the States to keep the health insurance I have here because of the clusterfuck that the health insurance industry is over there in the States.
Well, just make sure that your health insurance that you've got covers treatment in the United States, because a lot of coverage, I had coverage out of Asia, and they have a very real limit in terms of the cost of treatment here. Americans will often proclaim that they have the best healthcare system in the world, if you can afford to pay for it. Mm. But I challenge that now. There are areas of the world where certainly, there are various elements where technically I think offshore you get better service, better treatments. But the cost is insane. I went and did a full physical last year in Thailand, where I have an apartment. and full physical, with all the works, MRI stress test of the heart, everything. We're talking about $800 in total. The results were in real time. I would take blood tests. I would come back 20 minutes later and do that. It was really. And the quality of the equipment in the hospital, the training of the physicians, everything was top notch. The same, just one of the procedures that I did as part of that physical in Thailand would have been $14,000 in the United States. That just doesn't make sense. This is where you've got a completely privatized sort of healthcare system, as I think failed Americans and sort of failed. But this is where we're seeing it pan out now here.
Well, you see, the thing with this whole coronavirus for me, it's not necessarily the virus. It is, but it's not really, because it's the impact of the virus on the system. So the capitalistic system, the economy, and then of course the ripple effects that all of this has. I mean, we know that we touched on the stock market's bull run's officially over. 3,000 points wiped out in a single day. There was a rally back up to another 1,000 points, I think, on the NASDAQ. And
it's dropped again today.
And it's dropped again today. Dropping. The only thing that annoys me about this is the Bitcoin price won't run. But we wait and see. Okay.
Wow. If you've got a bit of cash, you can afford to buy in to anything right now. It's probably a good plan, but it's going to take a while. But this is it. This is where we get to. Is this a failure of capitalism? Is capitalism failed us?
Well, the thing is, what's interesting that you see, we're in a kind of a unique situation, right? Because what's happening in New York, where you are, for us or for me, it's like watching a car crash happen before it happens. So if New York closes its subway, it bans people from restaurants, bars, pubs, and things like this. And it literally locks down its people to stop the spread of the virus. When that happens in a developed economy like New York, sure as shit that's going to happen here. So the only thing that you can do is take the necessary steps in order to figure out, well, I've got a little bit of lead time here, as opposed to you in New York, where it was just you wake up one morning and suddenly you can't move. Right. And we're seeing like retail chains shut down, event companies being obliterated, travel companies shutting down. A friend of mine runs a travel agency and he's panicking. He said literally every booking he's made for this entire year has been cancelled for obvious reasons. And it's decimating entire economies literally overnight. And as you touched on this, Black Swan idea, where it's a combination of events that are just unprepared for completely. As I mentioned earlier, we kind of got caught with our pants down. And we're looking for leadership to stand up and lead and to make decisions for us, to give us a sense of, comfort despite all of our fear. And we've got leaders who, like Trump, are not doing that job well enough. It's like they're trying to protect the election as opposed to protecting the people. And so more broadly, then you look at the economic system and you say to yourself, well, what's next? Because, the health system for me is a big one. And I think it's going to pose some massive questions for us to answer as we move through this. When the shit hits the fan, the only way out is through, right? And so when we come through it, like, where are we going to be and what will the system need to be in order to safeguard, our future livelihoods financially and otherwise?
Well, this is actually what I'm writing on in my new book, which is entitled "The Rise of Techno-Socialism." And so I started writing this about a year ago. And my premise was that there were a number of black swan events or shocks to the system that were coming, that were largely inevitable, and that would change the way we thought about economics and democracy, for the next couple of hundred years. And, while the outlier of a pandemic was certainly something I discussed, and I discussed it in respect to both the fact that, air travel was always thought to accelerate this, but secondly, as climate change occurs, viruses are coming out of glaciers and stuff like that we don't have immunity to because they haven't been seen on the earth for hundreds of thousands of years. And so there was that on the healthcare side, but more critically, there was artificial intelligence producing this, potentially the same level of unemployment that we're talking about with the coronavirus impacting because of algorithms and robots replacing humans, and then the impact of climate change. You've got potentially 300 million people in coastal cities that will be displaced by sea rise over the next 50 years or so. And so, these are both events that would completely reshape the way we think about the world. And the problem with capitalism, as we see with the pandemic, is it's not incentivized to address these issues. When you have capitalism is geared towards the next quarterly or annual results of a company in the market, so that shareholders make their money. That's at the very heart of capitalism. And there's no mechanism where you should be trading off profits for a company next quarter for what could potentially happen in 30 or 40 years as a result of climate change. There's, the market is just not incentivized to make those trade-offs. And so that's where the problem lies here. And the other aspect of it is, and you see this more so in America and you see it in other places, is for those 46% of Americans today that don't believe coronavirus, that believe it's a hoax.
Still,
when in spite of all the evidence, when you look at that and you say why is that mentality emerging, then what you look at is, as in an ultra-capitalist society like the United States, you're always incentivized that where you want to be the winner, right? And that means other people can lose, and that's fine as long as money's going into your pocket. And so that's very much the mentality of the US system, and the reason the arguments for so long that universal healthcare has not been able to take a hold here is, wealthier people have access to health insurance say, well, you're just not working hard enough if you don't have health coverage, right? And you've got people working 3 jobs on minimum wage, and even at that basis, they can't afford even basic health coverage. They can't afford a 2-bedroom apartment on minimum wage working 40 hours a week, right? So, you have to look at that and say, this view that let's look after number one, let's focus on ourselves at the cost of everything else. The rights of the individual should prevail. That doesn't work because we're in a society. So, one of the things I've been saying is, in the US, you have this MAGA, Make America Great Again sort of premise behind Trump. But when you look at the needs of society, we have to start thinking about species first, not nation first, right? Humanity as a whole first. And this collective view is going to give us a much better chance of surviving and getting through this. But we have to dispense with the whole concept, or at least elements of the concept of the market. We have to be, I don't know how we're going to go, like the debt that we're going to incur over this, trillions and trillions of dollars that the governments are just going to put on their government credit cards to pay for all this stuff. At a certain point, this debt just becomes meaningless, when it represents the entire GDP of a nation, for example.
Yeah, it's a great point. There's a couple great points there. The first one is around, the private sector is not incentivized to take necessary steps to protect their employees, their business, and things like that. I mean, I've spent like a ridiculous, shocking amount of money for me just to enable my team to work from home, and that was like, well, who's paying for that? So for me, there's always a winner in this situation, and hopefully, as entrepreneurs, as business owners, you can position yourself as the company who can take advantage of this, which is what we're looking to kind of do ourselves. The other thing to say is that, there's I think it's something like a $1 trillion stimulus package that the US government is looking at mobilizing. So there isn't a short supply of money, but what would the effect of that be? Where they're going to print more money. The US economy is already hyperinflating itself, and therefore, by consequence, all the other world's economies have started hyperinflating their own currency because of the 2008 crash. And so when I look at that, I say to myself, well, what will the impact be if this is a black swan event and you have people who can't move? You got OPEC nations like producing so much oil and putting the oil price through the floor. You've got coronavirus. And then of course that's probably the major catalyst in all of this, because it has the biggest impact in the economic consequence of this for everybody. And I put out this video on LinkedIn, what my team did earlier today, where I said you can't be on the fence about this. If you're uncertain that you're in a fight for sustainability in terms of either your private wealth or your entrepreneurial venture and your own business, like Digital Kung Fu, our business, I'm very fucking concerned about the future. I really am. Not 5 years from now, but in the next 6 months to a year. What's my market going to look like? What does my operational structures need to look like? And what will they look like? Is it a permanent thing? Is it a short-term thing? And there's just more questions than anybody has answers for. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, you write about all this stuff all the time. You've got MOVEN.
I'm a futurist.
Yeah, you got your own digital bank. You've written more books than I will probably ever write in my life. Congratulations. You also have more podcasts than me, so screw you. No
worries, man.
Yeah, you're welcome. And you're obviously well versed in this thing. But what is your words of wisdom to take myself as an example? Or I've got a huge, entrepreneurial focused audience here, C-suites as well, and they're looking at all of this and they're concerned about the future. How does one begin to cultivate a mindset of relevance and sort of hope in this kind of climate that we seemingly are inheriting?
Well, actually, I'm quite optimistic that we come out of this with a better system than we went into it with. And I've generally thought that it's inevitable that we have to go through a transition to a different state. Because if it wasn't this pandemic, it was going to be AI or climate change that was going to get us there anyway. And I don't think the battle is going to be over. I think the capitalist system will still fight for relevance after things settle down here. But I do think that we're getting to the point with technology where we can actually solve a huge number of problems. And so when you look at something like universal basic income as an element, a lot of people talk about, well, that's, like it's going to, if you give UBI $1,000 or $2,000 a month to every American, then that's more than the entire IRS revenue that they take in, right? There's numbers like this floats around. But then when you say, well, let's look at universal health care, let's look at education, let's look at housing and shelter for homeless and so forth. The technical advances that we've made in recent years and the advances we're going to make over the next 50 years mean that we'll be able to provide those elements of society at a fraction of the cost of what typically has cost governments to do. And so, housing a homeless person today, if you're in Los Angeles, a homeless person living on Skid Row, and there's over 60,000 of them on Skid Row right now. And that's another discussion around how coronavirus is going to deal with that. But on average, the policing costs and the medical costs of managing that group works out to about $35,000 per person. Right? And we can now use 3D printing technology to build them a home for $3,000. Right, a basic apartment for $3,000, and so you have the technology to solve this problem. We don't have the will to solve this problem right now. If you look at healthcare, in the future, we will manage costs around healthcare because we'll be predictive in nature. So we'll monitor we'll have your DNA. We'll monitor blood work. We'll monitor your health through sensors, whether they're ingestibles or sensors that you wear on a smartwatch or in your clothing or something like that. We will monitor your healthcare and we'll be preventative in nature. So we'll use AI to diagnose conditions. We won't sort of guess at what your condition is. We'll have all this data to bring to bear, which means we'll be able to treat issues that come up at a fraction of the cost. Education will be ubiquitous. We're seeing evidence of kids being forced to have schooling at home, but in the future, they'll be able to put on their VR rig and be in a virtual classroom and things like that. And again, the cost of providing a really high quality education through this technology layer will be very cheap. So you've got elements of what we would traditionally call socialism, where in the future it's going to be more effective just to go with the flow and implement this technology to provide those basic services for society than to argue against it, frankly, because the costs will just be reduced through tech. So there's some positives coming out of the end of this, but it's going to take humans, probably the good part of 20 or 30 years to get into that change of psyche, and sort of grapple with these changes and how to best introduce these into society. As you start introducing all this automation, you're going to have a lot of skills displaced. And so people are talking about taxing robots and things like that to sort of try and mitigate the risk of that. But the reality is, if you don't have universal basic income or something like it in place for people who are displaced by things like coronavirus or artificial intelligence, then you're going to have social unrest. And so at some point you're saying, well, it's a risk mitigation strategy for, having a revolution take place, and the capitalist system is not going to say we don't want robots taking humans' jobs, because the entire stock market is geared towards productivity, So a lot of complexity there, but we come out of it better off than we are today, I hope. But it requires some real learning at a societal, and economic level.
Well, I like the fact that you're an optimist here. I think that's great. You're a shining light amongst the dark. Congratulations. So this workforce displacement thing is a real one, right? Because I mean, that number 825,000 jobs displaced just in the travel industry in the US. And then you think about, well, what are the other affected industries, and then the suppliers of those industries, and so suddenly that number starts to look like 8 million quite quickly. And as you say, what do these people do? Because they cannot absorb the hits of a $400 income difference. And then as you rightly pointed out, just think about health alone. There's how do you manage that? There's a friend of mine who actually moved to Austin, Texas, where I'm going. And within 2 weeks, his daughter was playing or something like that. And she apparently, quote, sprained her ankle, right? And so he went to the doctor and they looked at it and whatever. And then it went for an x-ray, and then it went for another person. And in the end, the bill was $12,000. But the ankle, the funny part about that story was the ankle actually wasn't even sprained. It was just, not broken. It was just a little bit sprained. And so he was like, well, what do I do with this? And he had health insurance. To your point, it was like the copay thing, and he was in for like $3,500 in the hole within the first 2 weeks. And so he's fortunate because he is financially independent. He has the cash to spend. But if you look at everybody else, the large majority, people in employment, you got RPA, robotic process automation, etc., artificial intelligence, all this stuff. And you combine this then with the threat of like black swan events like the coronavirus, suddenly you start to look at the workforce and you go, well, what do we do with them? To your point, because the consequence, the very negative consequence, as you pointed out, is revolution. Because when people can't feed themselves, when they can't draw money out of ATMs, that's when the shit really hits the fan. And the scary part is, to your point around the Second Amendment, it's like, well, I have a gun, so I will do what's necessary to protect my family. So these are kind of like some I know it sounds quite doomsday scenario, but it's actually quite real. It can happen. It's like we didn't think, outside of Bill Gates and his TED Talk, no one actually gave a shit about viruses. Yeah. Because it was never going to happen to America. Real. Yeah, it wasn't real. Yeah. And the funny thing was that it actually happened they were like, Ebola in America. Ebola in fucking Africa. That's where the problem's going to come. And meanwhile, Ling Ling, because she wanted to eat a bat, that's actually where no, is that bad? So dude, that's why that's why. So now we're all sitting with $1 trillion problem.
Well, I don't know about Ling Ling, but anyway, look, you're right. And here's the conundrum: is at what point do you get to where you say society can no longer absorb this level of a shock to the system? And, normally that would take an extended period of time to become, apparent. But in the US today, that's happening in very short order. So, here's the ironic thing is, Bernie Sanders has been running for president here over the last few months. He ran obviously back in 2016 as well. The conservatives have been talking about socialism, like it's like communism in the 1970s in the United States. It's a dirty word. No one wants to be labelized as a socialist here. But incredibly, in the space of now 3 weeks, they've gone from criticizing Bernie for being a socialist to implementing massive socialist policies. Handing out cash, guaranteeing sick leave, which, there's no such thing as sick leave provisions in the United States. There's no law requiring sick leave, until this law that's been proposed in the Senate today hopefully passes. And so you've got a situation where they're doing socialist things. They're saying, okay, Trump's saying you're not going to have to pay for your coronavirus test. This would have been unimaginable just a month ago, based on the US psyche. So you can see they understand exactly the risk of not doing these things. But it comes back to the point that until you had something like this, they weren't incentivized to start thinking about this, because the economy was all geared, sort of this neo-feudalism, where the corporations and the richest 1% of Americans had designed the system to have wealth flow back uphill constantly rather than to most Americans. There's a really great piece on this. Will Durant, who's a American historian, wrote on the not Wealth of Nations, that's Adam Smith, but on history of the world. And he wrote on the fact that there's basically two systems of governance that we've seen throughout history: a pyramid shape feudal system and a diamond shape, distributed system. So if you look at most of human history, we've been in a feudal system where the 1% or the elites, the lords in the system, or the monarchy, they control the mechanisms to create wealth. And so everyone underneath sort of works for the feudal system, and the wealth flows uphill. But the most successful economies in history have been diamond shaped. Phenomenally more successful. So you look at the post-Second World War US economy in the 60s and 70s, the creation of the American dream and all of that. This was the most productive economy we've ever seen throughout history. But it was a diamond shape. The distribution of wealth went to the middle class. You had massive growth in the middle class. Consumption was really healthy. It was really positive. And China has gone from a system like this to a diamond-based system over the last 20 years, where, again, you've seen this massive creation of wealth in the middle class in China. As a result, their economy has been booming. But there's a theory out there that the elite don't like that. So they're always trying to flatten the curve, flatten the diamond. And so that's what's happened in the United States since the 1980s, where you had the loss of collective bargaining and trade unions. You had the deregulation of financial markets. You have all of these things geared again towards, the wealth flowing uphill. And so really, I think we're learning that, these systems that are equitable, that create more of a distribution that are healthy for everybody, the more effective economies, and they mitigate against risks like this. But it's sort of breaking the back of this long-held system where the rich and powerful have been able to control policy and strategy.
The thing is, capitalism is the best system that we have. In many respects.
But it's flawed. And,
totally.
What we've got
it's
to
all
do
flawed. There is no perfect system.
Right. So we've got to learn from this and say, how do we improve on that? But that's where humans, I think, that's what we're actually good at that stuff once we get our mind around it, I think that's the point, is that we can fix this, but we have to be of the mindset that it's broken. and this defense of, well, capitalism is the best system we have, and so forth. And there's guys on my Facebook page right now today, when I talk about the fact that this has exposed the weaknesses in capitalism, they don't believe it. They're like, no, this is the best system we've got, and yet it doesn't. It hasn't catered for coronavirus. It has no mechanism for that, unless we're talking about wrecking huge national debt right now.
Mm. Is the American dream alive, or is it dead?
It is dead. You've got the greatest inequality in the United States ever in history today. You've got, as I mentioned, 2/3 of Americans who can't afford a $400 shock to the system. You've got an entire generation now, millennials and Gen Zs, who can't afford to buy their own home and will be renting for the rest of their life. So in terms of historically, what we would have said was here's the core of it. Why would people want to move to America in the 70s and 80s, right? Because this great economy, but you knew that if you could get into the US economy, you would, and you were prepared to work hard, you knew your children would have a better life than you. And that was always at the heart of the American dream. Well, today, no matter what you do, your children are going to be worse off, most likely, unless you're part of the 1%. And so that's at the heart of what's missing in the American dream today, is that it's no longer just based on the fact that if you work hard, you get ahead. That is no longer the case. The system is geared against you.
So Ling Ling shouldn't move to the States.
And she shouldn't eat bats. No, but no, I think, I don't know about moving to China either. China is an incredible place. I do a lot of work in China. I spent 7 years in Hong Kong, and visited China numerous times. I was in Shenzhen, January 5th and 6th. Mm-hmm. So very, very close to the epicenter of this. But having said all that, China is an incredible economy. But the way of life in China is very different, foreign to most Westerners in terms of the culture. It's effective in China, but it's not a perfect system there either. Let me just say that.
Yeah, it seems to me that the world's looking for answers and nobody really has good ones. But I suppose in this thing, it's kind of we're gonna need to develop some kind of, I don't know, solution, right? That's going to protect the middle class. It's going to encourage the idea, or the original seeds of the American dream, right? That if you create value and you become a person of value, and you make a difference to others, that you will benefit, right?
Well, here's the really interesting thing. Let's say in 30, 40 years' time, where automation is kicked in and manages many, many different parts of our society. Your groceries get delivered by robot, you have AI managing your healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. It's fairly realistic to expect that about 30 to 40% of people today that are working in jobs will be displaced. And so what are they going to do? The number of working hours historically is reducing. So, if you look at the start of the Industrial Revolution to today, and you track that out to sort of 2030, 2040, we're working about 20 hours a week of productive time in the future. And so we're working less hours, less people have jobs. What is the role of work in society? One of the first things that happen, we get on the podcast today and you ask me, what do I do? And my work is defining me when I explain that to you. And yet in the future, that's not going to be the way it is. So if we have universal basic income for people who aren't employed, or even for people who are employed, your basic costs of living are covered, like your housing, food, education for your kids, healthcare, as part of sort of this technology-based socialist system. and even if you then have, you can get all that covered, you're still going to want to do something. You're not going to sit on the couch in VR all day. Some people might, but you're still going to want to do something. So your work may not be your profession, like a podcaster, or whatever. Your work now may be what you pursue as a goal to better humanity. It could be, I'm involved in, climate change mitigation. I'm involved in researching this or that, and so we may have that freedom to actually really push forward the species because of these changes that take place. But it will change fundamentally the way society functions around things like work and schooling and so forth. If you have longevity treatments that kick in over the next 20 to 30 years, and you now have the potential to live to 120 or 130 or even longer, well, how long would you spend schooling? You wouldn't finish your schooling at the age of 18 or 22 in college. You'd probably continue learning until you're 30, right? Because there's no pressure for you to start work immediately. The changes to society will be pretty intense.
Yeah, I like that point there. The last one around what would the world look like in terms of careers if if a lot of the stuff that we do today that's manual was automated. And I guess you get two schools of thought, right? The first one is, well, the world will be unemployed, it'll be in the end times. And then the other one will be, well, because they're unemployed, they get to do other things, which will be creatively led. So looking for innovative solutions in bio, blah, blah, like COVID-25, and that's what I do. I like research, bio solutions for COVID-25. Too soon? Too soon. Okay. Yes. That's great. Coming from you, Brett, I'll listen.
But, I do think that it would be, like if I had an extra, 70, 80 years to run, then I'd be going, well, maybe I'll go and spend a decade on Mars. The possibilities are sort of really out there. And so, I think we're very limited right now today by the system we have, because it's like you work 9 to 5 to make sure you got enough rent to pay, enough money to pay the rent, and then buy stuff on Amazon, right? And like, this is not purpose.
Lies.
And, if you
lies, damn it. Fake news.
If you
don't listen.
Yeah, if you read philosophers like Aristotle and stuff like that, these guys were saying the purpose of humanity should be to better itself as a species. The purpose of humanity should not be to survive, but to thrive. And right now, we're in survival mode. And so, as a species, how do we get beyond that? And that is giving us the ability to be whatever we can be as a species. And that requires us to sort of dispense with this capitalist system in some manner that requires us to, basically just work to survive. So I think once we get over that work to survive piece and you have a universal basic asset structure or income structure in place, then you start to say, what can I do that I'm really passionate about? What can I do to improve the world? And so the outcomes of the hours that humans spend can be so much more productive in terms of determining our future.
So tell me, Brett, what would you do? So forget keynote speaking, you can't be writing about augmented life in this, none of that. You can't do any more number one bestsellers, okay? I'm done. You're done with that now. You've moved on. So the world, you're unemployed. What do you do? What's your thing? What would light you up?
Well, I would love to maybe look at some technology for rebuilding the polar ice caps once they've melted. I'd maybe spraying polymers over ice when it does regather and things like that, building up that. I would love to build or work on technology for carbon sequestration. So this is machines that can pull carbon out of the air and then use that carbon for positive things, like using it to build structures or build new batteries and stuff like that, using carbon nanotubes, for example. I would love to, explore the solar system. SpaceX and companies like that over the next 20, 30 years will make that possible. So, I got some, there's plenty of stuff, plenty of ideas I could come up with to use my time.
So that's great. That's congratulations. You know the thing. You know the thing that you see on movies, right? It's like, I don't know what movie. Don't quote me on this, right? But you know when they go, it must be a space thing. It's like an old movie, like from the 80s, where it was like a microwave or something, and then they took like this tiny little thing, this little seed thing, and oh, you know what it is? I got it. The world's best movie, The Fifth Element. When she takes the seed and she puts it in the microwave for like 10 seconds and then she opens it up and it's a roast chicken with roast potatoes.
Yeah, well, they had the same thing in Back to the Future. If you remember, they had a pizza scene in Back to the Future where, Michael J. Fox's bride in this case, but in the future, pops this very small Pizza Hut packet about this big into a rehydrator. And it rehydrates the pizza, and it comes out as a large family pizza. So but we'll have tech like that. It won't be rehydration or popping a seed in a microwave, but it might be 3D food printers. Eventually might be matter replicators like they have on Star Trek. So that's potential. But we'll have robots. It's really interesting. Back in those days, if you think about Fifth Element and you think about Back to the Future, we thought technology would be in improving the preparation of food. But now where we're going with that is actually we're using technology to improve the convenience of getting food. So now you see movies like Ready Player One. And the drones are delivering pizza, and so that's how we actually think of food production and delivery today. Also, on the other side, we've got lab-grown meat and stuff like that we're experimenting on, which is going to be much better for humans. Certainly, it's going to be big, strong arguments for lab-grown meat post-coronavirus, given that we suspect that coronavirus came from an animal. I think that's gonna be one of the spin-offs.
I actually met. We won Africa's Best Tech Startup Award, and we went to London, and I was at Lancaster Gate.
Congrats!
Thank you. And I went to Lancaster Gate. It was like this palace, and I was the only dude there wearing a printed shirt. Everybody else was a diplomat wearing a suit. So I was a complete sore thumb. But
you had a Hawaiian shirt on, or?
Oh no! I have some class, mate. I have some class, okay. And I met this Brazilian entrepreneur from a startup. He was also there, but he was in a suit, and he was growing artificial meat. I was like, that was his business. So it's closer than we think, eh? It's closer than we think.
And this is going to push it over the edge, I think, for a lot of people. But that supply chain view of food production has really changed significantly. We're going to automate a lot of the supply chain. The ingredients will get to factories quicker or labs, and they'll produce this stuff, spit it out, and then deliver it to our door, like Uber style. Although I don't know how Uber is going to go with the coronavirus, but
Well, I'm still buying, man. I'm still buying. I don't have time.
Yeah.
Boil eggs. What the hell? So Brett, last question. Let's wrap this up. Why do you do what you do? What gets you out of bed in the morning?
As you've probably gathered, I am a techno-optimist. I've studied history. I look at the changes technology has wrought on society over the last 300 years. And that's largely inevitable that cycle is going to continue, if not speed up. I'm optimistic about the future. And so I'm, as many futurists, I'm in a hurry to get to the future as quickly as possible. And so that's really what enthuses me. It's how do I get up in the morning? How do I change people's lives so they don't see this technology as a threat to their existing way of life, but they see it as a way to improve our lot as a whole, as a species. And I think collectively it's time for humanity to start focusing on how do we make life better for the entire planet, for everybody? We have the technical resources and the intelligence and the engineering skills and the entrepreneurial skills to do that. We just have to set our mind to it. And if that's the case, it doesn't have to be us and them. It doesn't have to be the 1% and the 99%. Everyone can benefit from this if we put our mind to improving the system for the species as a whole. And that's what gets me up in the morning.
Cool.
Let's do it.
Brett, where can our listeners go and get more information about you?
Sure, you can go to brettking.com and check that out. That's my personal homepage. You can check out MOVEN or MOVEN Enterprise, which is the fintech startup I have. You can also go to breakingbanks.com or provoke.fm, which is our media company, handles the podcast, and or Provoke Management, Provoke Social, which are elements of the business as well. Check out I'll go to Twitter @BrettKing. Check me out on LinkedIn. Social media is the main way I communicate with people these days. So happy to take inquiries in the digital realm.
Brett King, you've been a legend. Thanks for playing along. Thanks, mate. Cheers.
No worries, man.